Hello and welcome to another member request video, a series where YouTube and Patreon members can request a review for me to do, either an animated short or an episode from an animated TV series. The request I got this time was The Fox and the Grapes, released in 1941, and it's both written and directed by Frank Tashlin, and it's part of the Color Rhapsody series that Screen Gems Studios did for Columbia Pictures. So for those who aren't aware, because the name Color Rhapsody may not be as familiar as, say, Merry Melodies or Silly Symphonies, it's essentially the same thing. So Color Rhapsodies were essentially the premium cartoons that would cost more due to the fact that they were in color. Initially it was 2-strip Technicolor, and then later on it was 3-strip Technicolor. Once Disney's exclusivity with the 3-strip Technicolor process expired in 1935. Now, in case you haven't seen this one, this is the very first Fox and Crow short. And the story is very simple. Fox is out wanting to have a picnic in the forest. He sets out his picnic, but the crow is jealous of what the fox has and wants all that food, so he decides to consult his Aesop Fables book, or Aesop as it says in there, and he does the whole Fox and Grapes fable, where because foxes apparently want grapes, so he hangs up a bunch of grapes, and the rest of the short is the fox setting out to try and get those grapes. So it's definitely an interesting one. But in terms of trivia, I mean, the big one here is Frank Tashlin. Tashlin's just one of those workers that was just all over the place. He left Schlesinger Studios for a second time in 1938. He then worked for Disney in the story department, and while he didn't direct any shorts or anything like that, he actually contributed to what ended up being Mickey and the Beanstalk that was made well after he actually left Disney. Afterwards, and this is where we are right now, he ended up being a production manager at the Screen Gems Animation Studio in 1941. It didn't last too long, because he was fired over an argument with Columbia executives in 1942. But during his time there, however brief it may be, some interesting stuff has happened. He creates the Fox and the Crow shorts, which, as already mentioned, this is the first one. He directs 3. In fact, he only directs 3 shorts in his tenure at Screen Gems. He did supervise a lot more shorts, and you'll see in some of the shorts he'll have a supervised by Tashlin credit, but actually directed by someone else. So I would imagine it'd be a similar thing to what was happening at the Fleischer Studios, where it would say supervised by one of the Fleischers, and it was actually directed by somebody else. And both animators of this short, Bob Wickersham and Emery Hawkins, ended up going to the Warner Studio later on to animate. Bob Wickersham only came back briefly, but Emery Hawkins is a name people might know, especially if they've been following this channel. He did a lot of wonderful, crazy-looking animation when he was in Art Davis's unit. Speaking of Art Davis, he was also at Screen Gems at the time. He actually directed a few shorts, including the wonderful Little Match Girl a few years prior to this. So it's interesting how all these different studios connected in some way with their personnel. And speaking of connections, this is the only Fox and Crow short to have Mel Blanc doing the voices. He does the voices of both Fox and Crow. And this is because he ended up getting that exclusivity deal at Schlesinger Studios, so he would be credited there and he would work exclusively for them, and obviously whatever radio programs he was doing around that time. Which is a shame because his vocal work in this one is really good. But it's not exactly the most memorable thing. It's not like the voices he uses here are so distinctive like, say, Bugs Bunny or Porky Pig or anything like that, so I'd imagine it wouldn't have been that big a loss to replace him here. Still, he does great work. Now, this whole idea of Fox and Grapes, and it is touched upon in the short when the crow tries to get an idea of how he's going to get this picnic from the fox, it comes from the Aesop fable, The Fox and the Grapes, and to simply put, there are grapes that are just hanging up too high for the fox to reach. He tries many times to get it, and after a while he will just give up and say, you're not even ripe yet, I don't need any sour grapes, and would walk on, and that's that. So that's where all that comes from. But it is interesting that of all the things the crow could have come up with to try and get this lunch from the fox, he ends up choosing this Aesop fable of all things to try and do it. It's a very bizarre choice, but at least makes the short really interesting. While I will go through the short from start to finish, one interesting thing as well is how this short must have been something that influenced Chuck Jones later on in relation to the Wile E. Coyote Roadrunner shorts, because a lot of the gags later on when the fox is trying to get those grapes definitely come across as something you could see in any Roadrunner short. Now, I'm not saying Mark Maltese or Chuck Jones stole any ideas or anything like that, but given that there were a few shorts that Tasha made that Chuck Jones was definitely influenced by, which led to Pepe Le Pew, for example. I could definitely see Jones being influenced by this. Or even Mike Maltese, he may have seen this and got influenced himself. But what we're going to do is take a look at this short from start to finish and just go through my own observations. And one of the interesting things about the original title cards and the reissue is the actual title name, where in the original title cards, it was The Fox and the Grapes, and you can just see a whole bunch of grapes in the title. In the reissue, the short was just renamed as Fox and Grapes. Why? I don't know. But it's interesting that the re-release title card literally says a re-release on the bottom, unlike, say, the Blue Ribbon program. So we see our Fox character whistling along to the Tales from the Vienna Woods, which is very interesting because when Tashlin comes back to the Schlesinger studio, one of the things he works on is the story for Corny Concerto, and one of the segments was based from the Tales from the Vienna Woods, so it's an interesting little coincidence. But when watching this, along with the other two shorts that Tashlin directs while he's at Screen Gems, you can definitely notice what I like to call the missing link. So the Schlesinger shorts from the 1930s had a certain look around them. The characters were a lot more rounder and they had a more modern style. But then you go to the 1940s and Frank Tashlin's using his Scott art technique, so his style definitely evolved. Watching these Screen Gem ones, it's interesting to see the in-between phase. Although the designs here definitely skew more towards the Scott art technique and look more like something that would come from the 1940s Schlesinger shorts that he would direct. So if you look at the design of this Fox, for example, then in the face alone, you just got these ovals, you got the triangle for the nose. So it's very stylized, and surely by this point he was a practitioner of using the Scott art technique. So we see it starts off fairly slow, but it just shows off the Fox's character. After all, this is the first appearance. He's skipping along, he's making up his own lyrics to the Tales from the Vienna Woods, goes through a log, the hat even bounces on his head to the rhythm as well. But I gotta say, the backgrounds look incredibly stunning in this one. So I wonder if this is Tashlin's way to do a parody of a Silly Symphony short or a Disney short having lush backgrounds. I mean, he just came from Disney, so maybe he still had Disney on the brain, I don't know. And I love the different choice of angles that Tashlin chooses while he's directing this opening bit. So while, yes, it takes a while and we're just seeing him skipping and dancing, being excited to have a picnic, at least Tashlin makes it look interesting. There's even one point where we see his butt bouncing around and we even hear the sound of a drum as it bounces along, so Tashlin's being a little bit cheeky here. So then we pan up to a tree where we see our other character, the crow. And this is probably an even more greater example of Tashlin moving towards using the Scott art technique. And also a lot of the posing of this crow would be something that Tashlin would use a lot when he made his shorts in the 1940s. So the crow decides to put signs down in order to have the fox to have his picnic there. And we see a few signs here: perfect picnic grounds, no ants in our plants, a tisket, a tasket, park your yellow basket, which is based off a children's nursery rhyme. George Washington ate here. I'm sure he did. Not even Charlie's ant. Charlie's ants are bugs that are actually beetles that kind of look like ants, and they're called Charlie's ant. So in case you're wondering what that is. Reserved for the Little Foxes. I believe that is a play on the 1939 play, and that ended up becoming a 1941 movie that's actually based on that play. I can't find anything else in relation to it. I'm pretty sure that's what it's relating to. I mean, Tashlin would refer to movies and pop culture in quite a few of his shorts, so I'm pretty sure that's it. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. And my favorite, Garden of Eat-In, a play on Garden of Eden. Ha ha. And thankfully Tashlin pauses on those signs for a good moment so everyone can actually read all of them. Sometimes when I'm watching something, there'll be a whole bunch of words around, but director or editor decides for whatever reason just to cut straight away and you end up missing the entire thing. So the fox rolls out the picnic, and I gotta say, that's quite a spread. Definitely more than what one person would actually have. I mean, he could have shared with this crow, but I guess the crow also wants all that for himself. As the fox begins to try and eat, he sees that the crow is trying to steal all those sausages, and he does the good old hot foot. A gag that you've seen in quite a few shorts, including some over at Schlesinger, and you can see that sort of thing even at the Schlesinger Christmas party videos. So the crow goes up, and again, I like the fact that he's got an elevator inside the tree trunk somehow, and he needs to then cool down his foot. I like the fact, though, that in the next scene, you see that he's actually got a bandage around his foot, so there's some continuity here, but Tashlin chose not to even try any other ways for this crow to try and get the fox's food. he immediately goes straight into the most ridiculous idea imaginable, which is the whole Fox and Crow fable, which I already mentioned. And I still love the fact that it's Aesop's fables. But I'm pretty sure Aesop didn't say foxes are suckers for grapes. Maybe Aesop said it, but Aesop certainly didn't. And we get a nice little nod on the bottom, especially in gorgeous Technicolor. I can imagine this being projected by film that the purple of the grapes would have absolutely popped in Technicolor. So the Crow brings out the grapes, and again he's still got the bandage around the foot. Again, wonderful continuity, and a wonderful angle showing us just how high the Crow actually is, and just showing us just how high the fox eventually will have to try to get those grapes. But in the next shot, the bandage on the foot disappears, and that's okay. I'm actually surprised that that bandage lasted as long as it did in the continuity. So the Crow, who somehow gets the hammer from inside a pocket, which is a ridiculous detail, hammers up the grapes, and the fox spits out the coffees and gets all excited for the grapes. Now I have to wonder though, why is this fox so excited for grapes? Like, what's so special about grapes? He's got a whole spread there and yet he wants that? That's just insane. Oh, and look, the bandage is back. How dare there be a continuity error? How dare there? I'm kidding, of course. It's just interesting, probably being a case of the different animators, maybe one of them forgot to add it in or something, I don't know. So the Crow tries to make a deal with the fox, saying, hey, I'll give you these grapes if you give me your lunch. And I love the voice that Blanc does here. It does that whole tough guy voice that he would often do. So the fox says, don't bother, I'll just jump up and get him. And then the Crow has to check the Aesop fables, which conveniently has the words, don't worry, he can't jump that high. And that's a story idea that Tashlin would revisit later on at Schlesinger's for Brother Brat, where Porky keeps referring to the book, which conveniently says what needs to be said to push the story forward. So the Crow breathes a sigh of relief, and now we get to the part which must have influenced Chuck Jones for the Roadrunner series. I'm pretty sure I heard somewhere that Jones did mention regarding the Fox and the Crow short as being an influence. If that's the case, definitely let me know. But from here on, the pace of this short picks up, and that's a trend that Tashlin often did, where the shorts he would do would start off pretty slow and then would pick up towards the end. So we see the fox build up so much speed and even drag up the actual grass on the ground somehow, and would just miss grabbing the grapes and falling through the bridge and through the water, making a beautiful silhouette in the water as well. But I love the special effects here. You got the silhouette there, then the water just fills up and we see that the fox just comes up. So in a second attempt, Fox ends up using a pole to try and pole vault up, but no, the pole breaks and he ends up falling to the ground, smashing right into his hat. And note how the Crow marks down each failed attempt that the fox actually does. You get a wonderful payoff with that. So the next bit involves a rock on lever, which again, this is something that would have definitely influenced a gag when it came to Cody or even Ralph Wolf in the Sam Sheepdog shorts. But full props again to the effects animators here, where the rock falls down onto the fox and everything ends up just getting sucked into the earth like that. It's fantastic animation. I can imagine that the Screen Gem Studios' budgets would not have been as high as many of the other studios. But Tashlin, when he was in the lower budgeted part of the Schlesinger studio making the black and white Porkies, he definitely did a lot with less when it came to the budgets. Now Tashlin could have just stopped there when he fell through the ground, but no, we get that wonderful little payoff where he's fallen so far down, he actually ends up in a mine shaft, and we see all these miners just look incredibly shocked and incredibly grateful, I'm assuming, that they didn't get crushed to death by this fox. So another attempt where the fox ties up a tree in order to get him to fling off into the sky, but no, his foot was trapped inside the rope and he ends up being flung backwards and forwards. So we continue getting that wonderful payoff where the whole tree trunk has been marked down with the number of attempts. But again, full props to Tashlin for keeping the continuity going where the actual foot still has that bandage. So the fox pretty much gives up and he says, okay, do you want to now make that trade? And he definitely looks worse for wear. I mean, given what we've seen so far, you have to wonder exactly what on earth were all the other attempts that caused him to be battered up so much. So the fox throws up the lunch. Wonderful animation of the food going up from that angle, and in a twist, the Crow, instead of doing what he promised, he's going to keep the grapes himself, which ends up making the fox angry. And here's another trait that Tashlin did in a lot of his shorts. So there would be a montage of some sort, and in this case, we're seeing all the various other attempts before, and this part usually would save the studio a fair bit of money because it'd be fairly easy to do. You just rerun the same footage as before. So we have our last attempt to get the grapes, and this one is one of the more obvious Roadrunner inspired parts because he's got a rocket strapped to his back. So this is all done nicely in silhouette at night, so I guess it would have taken him a while to actually even get one of those rockets. Fires up, again, beautiful special effects, and even the colors that you do see here absolutely stand out, and he ends up destroying the tree, and he finally gets to have a grape. But in a nod and a wink to the Fable, he eats the grape, but it's sour grapes. It's not quite how the Aesop fable goes, but it's a nice little touch. And we end right there with Fox being all upset, and it's all still done in silhouette, which is an interesting way to end things. And we're right there. So this is a wonderful short, and again, it's interesting seeing the missing link between the two directing periods for Tashlin at the Schlesinger studio. You can see elements of his work in the 30s, but you can also see the stuff that he would do in the 40s coming to play here, especially with the Scott art technique. So it's definitely an in-between kind of thing here. This is a wonderful cartoon. It's not the greatest thing I've ever seen or anything, but it's a solid short, well done, and this is probably the purest you're going to ever get with Tashlin, given that he wrote, produced, and directed this one. The only thing closer would have been if he animated this as well, because he was also an animator, but honestly, he was probably way too busy to do that. This one gets 9 out of 10. It's a fun short, and it's easy to find online if you look hard enough, and I hope that this comes out in a proper restoration. But that'll do it for this one. If you want to request a short or a TV episode for me to do, simply become a Patreon or YouTube member. But that'll do it for this one. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and until next time, take care.
Mine. Sour grapes!